Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us in Health Connect South. I am Krish Roy. I am Professor of Biomedical Engineering in Georgia Tech, and today we are going to discuss about the partnerships and collaborations that are part of the center called CMAT, Center for Cell Manufacturing Technologies. And with me today are four outstanding partners for CMAT: Amy Kaplan, Aaron Levine, Greg Rizzotti, and Shenglin Gibson. And I will let each of them introduce very briefly, and then we'll go into some of our discussions. Amy, you want to start? Amy, you're muted.
First faux pas. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Kaplan. I'm a patient advocate. My 6-year-old daughter passed away from acute lymphoblastic leukemia in 2017. She participated in the CAR T-cell or Kymriah clinical trial back in 2016. And so I've been involved with CMAT since 2018.
Thanks, Amy. Aaron?
Thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaron Levine. I'm an associate professor at the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech, and for the last 15 or so years, I've been conducting research on the intersection of bioethics, public policy, and biomedical research, and I'm really interested in how policy choices affect the conduct of research and the translation of new technologies into the clinic.
Greg?
Thanks, Krish. I'm Greg Rizzotti, Chief Technology Officer at Century Therapeutics, responsible for technical development and manufacturing and quality. Century is a member of CMAT, and prior to joining Century about a year ago, I was at Celgene in the cell therapy division for about 13 years, where Celgene was also a member of CMAT, and I was one of the lead representatives working with CMAT since the inception. Thanks.
Thank you. Sheng?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shenglin Gibson. I'm the chief of the NIST Biosystems and Biomaterials Division. NIST is one of the government agencies that's within the Department of Commerce. So at NIST, I lead the Advanced Therapy Program, where we develop a measurement science program and provides the data, the measurement tools, and coordination to develop standards to advance economy and biotechnology. Thanks, pleasure to be here.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. So as you can see, we already have a very strong stakeholder group of collaborators in CMAT. And I want to take just a very few minutes to introduce everybody to CMAT today. So CMAT stands for Center for Cell Manufacturing Technologies. It's a National Science Foundation funded center that spans across 8 different universities in the country and 3 international universities and organizations in Canada, in Japan, and in Ireland. So already from a structural point of view, it is based on partnerships and collaborations, which is certainly the direction and motto of Health Connect South and why we are here today. But what CMAT is focused on is entirely focused on making cell-based therapies more accessible, more cost-effective, more higher quality, more scalable for all people around the world. And so for those of you who are not so aware of cell therapies, these are therapies that uses our cells, manipulates them, grows them outside the body, and then infuse them back into the patient to try to cure and treat a variety of chronic and acute diseases. And the most stunning examples of that comes from the approval of a few therapies this past few years by the FDA called T-cell therapies or CAR T-cell therapies that Amy mentioned briefly for cancer, especially pediatric cancers as well as adult lymphomas. And there has been a really fantastic progress and tremendous promise of cell therapies. And so CMAT really is dedicated to work on the engineering aspects and the scientific aspects. But there is a broad understanding that we cannot do that without forming partnerships with this tremendous stakeholders group, the patient advocates, the policy and ethics experts, industry in particular, the government organizations and standards organizations, education experts, workforce experts. So we'll talk about today how each of these partnerships takes place. Within the Southeastern region, CMAT certainly is headquartered at Georgia Tech, but it also involves the University of Georgia, Emory University, and then nationally it involves University of Puerto Rico, Wisconsin-Madison, Gladstone, UCSF, University of Oregon, and University of Pennsylvania. So within that broad stakeholder group, we also, not only in research, but a tremendous emphasis on education and workforce development. And we work with high school partners, we work with partners in technical college system in Georgia and Wisconsin, obviously educational experts in the undergraduate and graduate education. So it's a broad stakeholder community that is showcased and really that partnership that makes us work. So with that, I want to go into a few discussions with each of the stakeholder members who are represented here. And I want to first start with Greg Rizzotti, Dr. Rizzotti from Century Therapeutics. And what I wanted to talk to Greg about is really this idea of industry-academic partnership to advance healthcare, and specifically in this case, to advance cell therapies in the context of CMAT. So Greg, what would you consider to be the relative roles of academia and industry, especially in the context of cell therapy and driving the manufacturing of cell therapies? And how do you think that CMAT fits into that?
Thanks, Krish. So as you mentioned before, it's really important to get the cost of these cell therapies down and to provide more accessibility to more patients, more reliability, higher quality. I think the role of industry is to help explain to academia and others what the real problems are, that if we solve them, we can get the cost down and we can get the products to be higher quality. And then as we help academia understand better what those problems are, we could then help direct academia to take their cutting edge technologies and apply them to solve some of these problems. So I think where academia brings expertise is they have a lot of new innovative technologies that can be used for a number of things, but don't always know exactly how to apply them. So that's the marriage I think that we have to try to perfect in order for those two groups to have these important relative roles in solving these problems.
And do you think, just to follow up on that, at what stage should that collaboration occur, right? Should it happen very early in from the research state onwards, as early as possible, or do you think there is a sort of a sweet spot, if you may, for things to work together?
I think it has to happen early because a lot of these problems are very complex and the solutions are complex. And when you implement solutions, either in a development environment where you're trying to do clinical trials or a manufacturing environment where you have a commercializable product, it's often a long path to making a change. You have to show comparability first of your product, then you have to show comparability maybe in animal studies and ultimately in a clinical trial if it's a very big change. So it's important to do that work in advance so that you can actually bring it to fruition in a reasonable amount of time. So you always have to be thinking ahead, getting ahead of what the problems are, and looking for these solutions together way ahead of time. And a lot of them aren't going to work out either. That's another reason to get ahead of it, because it takes a lot of time sometimes to develop these things, and you should be doing multiple things at once because some of them are going to be dead ends and others may not work as well as you like. So when you have that one that does work, you'll be happy that you spent time in advance on it.
That's a great point. I wanted to ask, Shang maybe here a little bit. You, from a government side of things, work in a lot of these consortiums, right? Where academia and industry are together, and a lot of different industry are together. How, from a government organization standpoint, do you all see the importance of that? And how do you think that drives innovation or drives the field forward?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think this is one of the great example of what I consider partnerships. So of course, coming from the government agencies, a lot of what I'm involved in are public-private partnerships. But what's important here, particularly with CMAT, is the ability to bring in leading edge research institutions together with industry. And I'm very, I have the pleasure to be part of this by also, seeing other government agencies present so that we also get to see the developers, the real world challenges. And, it helps me get a good perspective on what are the common challenges and how we can help. But more importantly, I think, these early conversations on how to address these bigger challenges are invaluable.
Great, thank you. Just for the audience, we partner with large companies, small companies, medium-sized companies of all flavors. We have now about 20 industry partners, industry members in CMAT that ranges from big pharma to startups across the whole nation. And really the idea there for us is to understand from industry what their need is, and really focus our work to fulfill that industry need. So things that are developed in labs or in academia gets translated faster to the patient. And not only just faster, but as Greg mentioned, through that feedback mechanism, we are avoiding a lot of the pitfalls early on, and are able to address the need of the industry much better. Maybe I can, go back to Greg and ask, how do you think that these partnerships, and you have seen a lot of them over the years, I'm sure, really what maybe in your mind are some of the best practices for academic researchers to work with industry? And where do you think there are challenges or barriers that can be improved maybe? Especially related to the manufacturing sides that CMAT works on.
Yeah, Krish, I think CMAT got it right, because CMAT, before it was even put together, had the leaders within CMAT do a really deep exercise, which I was fortunate to be part of, to understand what the challenges really were. So, we did a roadmap exercise to figure out how were we going to make the U.S. a leader in cell therapy manufacturing. And Krish, remind me, was it 2016 we started that, or 17? That was a long time ago.
Yeah, it was 2016 that it was released. We started about a year before that.
So 2015 we started. So we spent a lot of time, about a year, bringing a lot of experts together. And I think what that did was it helped academia and industry understand each other. Because I don't think it's academia's job to really know exactly what's going on in industry, how to make things work, what the real problems are. And it's not industry's, I guess, job, or really their ability to know what academia has in their toolbox. So having those conversations early helped academia be able to say, whoa, okay, I have this tool, I have that technology, I think it might be able to be applied here. And then you have some deep conversations about that. I think that's the hardest thing with consortia like this, is that the folks in academia will understand pretty quickly what the problem is, but they won't always understand how to solve it. And they'll say, I have this tool and I think I want to use it. But it's not as simple as use the tool. It's a conversation and a set of discussions that have to be had between the experts on both sides to understand, could that tool be used? How would you have to develop it and apply it? And then you have to go ahead and do the experiment. So I think the advantage CMAT had is that we did that early, and then we continue to have conversations, and we're still learning. We're not perfect at it. I think both sides have to spend more time learning from each other and understanding what's out there, because tools are constantly being developed by academia. And again, a very ambitious academician is going to say, oh, I have this great tool, I think I want to use it right away, and I think it can be used here, but they have to understand the problem and then think about how it's really going to solve that problem.
That's a great point. And just for the audience here, what Greg was referring to is back in 2014, 2015, we actually got a grant from NIST, and Sheng was part of that endeavor also. And these were these advanced manufacturing grants, which allowed us to bring all these stakeholders together even before, years before we started the center, and really ask the question, what are the challenges and barriers for us to develop cell-based therapies as a product in the United States and have leadership in the United States. And we brought that together. It was a year and a half worth of exercise that was ultimately published by the Office of Science Technology Policy at the White House. And then we have come almost every year, every other year together since to update that roadmap and to really frame that, what should we work on? What does industry need? What do they want to see in 5 years, 10 years time frame? And I really encourage everybody, the website for CMAT is www.cellmanufacturingusa, which is one word, cellmanufacturingusa.org. and you can go and see what we are working on, who all the partners are, and so on. Maybe I wanted to ask Amy, from a patient perspective, Amy, when you see this happening between collaboration between industry and academia, as someone who would be the ultimate recipient of these products or therapies, what is your thought as to, what do you feel in terms of that collaboration? Do you think it's great, it should happen as much as possible? Are there any concerns from a patient perspective that you think that might be?
Thanks, Krish. Absolutely. And I think the role of the patient advocate, I can really help bridge all of the partners together, because like you said, ultimately our goal is, the patient care. But if we don't understand all the complications or other concerns to think about during that process, we can talk and connect all we want if we're not making advances. But I can go into a little bit further of just how important the manufacturing process, like what that does from the patient perspective.
Yeah, I think we will come back to that
Okay.
part, but in a minute. Thank you so much. Maybe what we should do now is talk a little bit, kind of switch topic and talk about the role of policy and ethics in cell therapy. And from our perspective, we are a bunch of engineers, and CMAT really has this wide group of expertise in terms of the scientific and engineering expertise there. Industrial engineers, manufacturing engineers, chemical, bioengineers, electrical engineers, immunologists, clinicians, basic scientists. But the glue that holds us together are really the patients and the patients' perspectives, and that collaborations with industry and other stakeholders. But beyond all of this, I think, our philosophy has always been that if we do not frame all of these in the context of public policy and healthcare policy and healthcare structure, then we will not be able to make the impact that we want to make. All of us wants to make to our patients and the patient community. So I wanted to ask Aaron Levine here to really set up the framework on how he sees that public policy can help or hinder the development of cell therapies as a widely used product, widely accessible product, and how does what role does CMAT or similar organizations can play in that domain, in the domain of public policy? Aaron?
Thanks, Krish. Sorry, struggling to get off mute there. But I think a really important question. We can have all the technology in the world, but if it doesn't fit within that policy framework, it might not reach patients or reach patients as efficiently and effectively as possible. But let me step back. I think it's really important to see that policy affects the development of cell therapies across the entire spectrum, starting at the very earliest days in the lab. What is funded? So much of the biomedical research, the bioengineering research is funded by federal money, right? Funded by the NIH or the NSF, who of course funds CMAT. Right? So there's funding decisions. But then as we move through the basic research and into the translation, there are really critical policy questions about, what can be tried in humans? What research is promising enough to warrant experimentation, to warrant testing in human subjects or human participants? And then, as research continues, as clinical research continues, what is the right amount of evidence to say this new cell therapy is safe enough, is effective enough to be used, to be put on the market, to be given market access, and then to be prescribed to patients, right? So there's a whole series of policy levers that go from the basic research lab into the market approval step. And I think that's one important area for CMAT. And it's an area where I think your framing of helping or hindering is really quite appropriate, right? So the FDA, which is the key regulatory agency here, is working with rules that predate cell therapies, right? That were originally developed for other kinds of therapeutics and has had to work a little bit to figure out how best to fit these really exciting, really powerful emerging therapies into that framework. And so that can work really well in some cases, but can also pose challenges. And I want to just put a shout out back to Greg. I think the insights from industry here are really critical, right? It's really important to know from industry, not just, what is the technology that we're lacking or that can help us move something forward, but where are we running into challenges navigating the regulatory process, or what tool would help move through the regulatory process. And I think, one of the initial places for a CMAT improvement is some of the really great technology might feed into that regulatory process, might help firms better meet the FDA criteria, might better demonstrate consistency in manufacturing or markers for efficacy or those sorts of things. So I think there's a lot to say there. The other point I really want to highlight, and I think this will connect from the policy to the ethics, is what happens once a cell therapy is approved and is on the market. So Kymriah, for example, right, costs $475,000 per dose, only a single dose required typically, but per dose in a pediatric population. And that's just the treatment. There's an estimation that it might cost $1 million total for that course of treatment. How does our healthcare system, what are the health policies that allow us to cover that, to provide access to that, and not just to the, upper classes, not just to the wealthy? How do we make this widely available? And that is at its heart a policy question. I mean, it has an economic dimensions and other dimensions as well. But I think a fundamental challenge for CMAT and really society as we go from these therapies being approved in small markets of hundreds to maybe 1,000 patients to markets with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of patients, where our healthcare system, I think, really can't handle $500,000 payments on that scale, right? So I think there's going to be some real policy challenges to address.
Excellent. And maybe I can follow up with that. You mentioned the issue of ethics. What is, in your mind, are the ethical challenges or ethical issues surrounding cell therapies now in the US specifically? And where do you think organizations like CMAT can contribute?
So that's a good question. Traditionally in cell therapies, we've thought about like the source of the cells as a real ethical issue. Where does the cell material come from? But in the cell therapies we've been focusing on within CMAT, I see the field moving a little beyond that and focusing more on these issues of affordability and access. How can you? It's a matter of ethics. It's a matter of fairness to make these therapies as widely available to patients who need them, to patients for whom they're an appropriate course of care. And how do you make that work? Who pays? How much can you pay? Right? And how can you do this without breaking the healthcare system? I think are fundamental ethical issues. And of course, this is in a context where we have enormous and very troubling and problematic health disparities within the United States, and health disparities in the context of much more affordable care than these emerging cell therapies, right? So we need to be thinking about the systematic issues in the healthcare system, but also, and that's frankly a little beyond CMAT, I would suspect, but we need to be thinking about what CMAT can do as these new therapies are being developed to build in the access, to build in the equity. And so I think that is a combination of technological advances to make things cheaper, safer, more reliable, but also with some systems engineering, some prioritization. How do you figure out which patient needs the therapy immediately? And some sequencing can help. But some of this is also, policy. How can you figure out a payment model that makes this work? If this is a one-time treatment that might add decades to someone's life, do we really need to pay for it all up front? Or are there new approaches that allow us to pay for that over time? And so these are issues that CMAT can contribute to through our research, but also through the consortium and the collaboration and bringing these various stakeholders together to affect public policy, to raise questions, that sort of thing.
That's all great point. Maybe I can follow up and ask Greg a little bit. From where you sit as a leader in industry, this issue of access and cost, how does industry think about it? It's certainly not an academic exercise only.
Right. So I'll just frame this out a couple of ways. Actually, first of all, maybe for the purpose of the audience, what Aaron said a little while ago about the fact that cell source is really not much of an ethical concern anymore, just so people understand, most of the cells that companies are now sourcing, at least that my companies have been involved with, but also the types of technology CMAT is interested in, either come from healthy donors that are consenting fully to use their cells for the research and ultimately for production, or from the patients themselves when we're taking their cells and manipulating and giving them back. So that takes that off the table. Back to your question, Krish. If you think about that case where you're taking a patient's cells, manipulating them and giving them back, it is a very expensive proposition for industry. So it's not like industry is trying to make a lot of money off of this. What's happening is it's extremely expensive to go patient by patient, batch by batch, as opposed to a traditional pharmaceutical model where you can make very large amounts of product within one batch. Some of those are still expensive, right? Some of the traditional biologic products are very expensive to make, but when you're doing one batch at a time of patient cells with very expensive reagents and lots of labor, it's just an expensive proposition. So what industry thinks about that is the companies that are doing these autologous processes where the product goes back to the patient, they're trying to find ways to automate these processes, reduce the labor, shorten the processes, find ways to find the right cells, as opposed to getting a mix of cells and then expanding many of them to get a dose that's effective. So there's lots of technologies that can bring that cost down. And then there's a whole other wave of therapies, which I'm involved with now at Century, but many companies are involved with, which is to not have it be personalized where the patient can only get his or her own cells back, but they got a universal donor type model where you can take a cell, genetically modify it so it doesn't cause an immune response to the patient or doesn't attack the patient, because those are the two things that can happen if you put T cells in a different patient. So if you can genetically modify it or come up with some sort of source that doesn't have this negative effect where it can be a universal donor, then you can make very large batches of cells that can handle multiple doses for any patient in one batch, and that will really drive the cost down. So those are the two ways that I believe industry in general is going about reducing the cost.
That's great. So it's really going towards mass production and scale to reduce cost, and then that cost gets transferred to the consumer cost. And so that's a great point.
In the latter model, if you can get a universal donor, but in the case of the autologous, which I think it works remarkably well, it's going to continue to be an important therapy. That's a matter of driving that batch by batch cost down through things like automation, and I think more importantly in automation, simplification of the processes.
Right. Great. And I know, Amy, you really think about these issues of cost and access as a patient advocate all the time. I wanted to kind of go to you to ask is, how do you think, the issues that Greg mentioned that CMAT works on in terms of scale and access, what are your thoughts on how manufacturing and especially the work that CMAT does can impact the patient side of things?
Sure. And like Greg was referring to the either a single batch or more a generic, or not generic, but a larger batch. For the CAR T-cell therapy, when we were involved in that clinical trial, we extracted her T-cells, and that felt like the longest waiting period probably of my life. Since it was in the clinical trial process, we didn't actually receive the modified cells for almost 3 months. And for a cancer patient, time works against that person. And unfortunately, my daughter's cancer mutated much more, got much more aggressive during that time period, or that waiting period. So absolutely, the industry and manufacturing process of speeding up that process it could make a difference of life or death. Now, if it had already been FDA approved, then the process would have been normally about 4 weeks. So I think CMAT's gotten involved of looking very closely at that process of just taking out a week or a number of days. That can be so critical from a patient's perspective, because the doctors are just scratching their head trying any way possible to keep the cancer at bay during that time period. And it was a challenge. I just never even anticipated how difficult that would be.
Thank you so much for sharing this perspective. And it is sort of that moment where you are, you know, waiting for that therapy to be manufactured or ready. And as Greg mentioned, this is a complex, expensive, highly labor intensive process right now. And how do we use automations, better science, better technologies? That is a huge part of this. And you know, the other side of this is really the regulatory side. You mentioned that, you know, when your daughter was you know, several years ago, it was still part of the clinical trial process. That particular therapy has gone through regulatory approval, and many kids are getting treated now. But there are many other therapies that are in that pipeline, and you personally have experienced the regulatory process. You are there with the FDA at that point. You know, what are your experience and thoughts, and what would you say to the regulators in terms of the need for the patients, and how does the regulatory approvals, clinical trials affect the patient story?
Yeah, and I think Aaron nailed this one of the treatments are so different today than they were many years ago. So the immunotherapies, and when the doctors were presenting the Kymriah and at the FDA hearing, it was very just so powerful to hear them present the results and to be able to hopefully speed up this process. I think they understood the importance of this is not just a one pill that a patient's going to take, and let's see how we can advance this into accessibility to patients, because especially from a pediatric cancer perspective, there had been no advances in treatments in almost 40 years. So this cell therapy, I feel like it was a game changer back in July of 2017 when the FDA approved it. And we've seen a lot more movement with the FDA and quicker approvals with other cell-based therapies, which to me is encouraging, very encouraging.
That's great. And I think Aaron mentioned that earlier also, that there is really, you know, rethinking of the policies, rethinking of the regulatory mechanisms, and so on. And maybe we will have some time at the end to come back to that. But I wanted to go to Sheng a little bit. You know, as we heard about the role industry plays, you know, what patients want, there is this whole framework of regulations and public policy. Where do you think standards fit into that? And you are part of NIST, which in many ways is the quintessential standards organization. And how do you see NIST's role and overall the standards community's role in advancing cell therapies, and how an organization or a consortium like CMAT can help in that?
Right. Yeah, I think there are many different ways standards can help. As Greg and Chris, we talk about already, what we're talking about here is really exciting, broad class of therapeutics, right, for treating so many different diseases. Another part that I think we covered is that the speed at which this technology is evolving, and the conversation that we need to have just to keep pace, right, with respect to the science and the manufacturing technology and some of these considerations that touches on patients and policy. Where standards come in, from my perspective, is that, you know, these are the tools, foundational tools that can really help people develop and accelerate a lot of these things that we talk about, right? So standards comes in many different flavors, but really it's all about accelerating R&D, right? It's about not reinventing what others have done or know or best practices already. It's about shared practice. It's about taking us there faster. That's one way to think about it. From the industry perspective, we're talking about a lot of different players. So, you know, Greg's company will do business with many others. And so he needs some confidence when he receives, say, materials or reagents or equipment. he needs to have some confidence in how they operate and perform. And so standards is another piece that can really give you some confidence. It can ensure interoperability, and it can help with understanding quality. And then another piece that we also talked about is this regulatory approval, right? We're talking about drugs, therapeutics that we need to ensure safety and efficacy. So how do you demonstrate that? So it's actually pretty difficult. It's a lot of work that actually go through to test the safety and efficacy. You know, Greg talked about, you know, even downstream, you have to think about maybe human trials. But let's just talk about the upstream development work and testing to ensure the quality. There's a whole infrastructure that's needed for the measurements. And so a lot of what we think about is, okay, do we really want every lab or every company invent their own methods? Wouldn't it be great if we submit a package to FDA where they can actually understand analytical methods and say, okay, I get it. I know what this data means, right? So that's another way the standards can help. So that's at least there, you know, there are other roles that standards can play, but you know, I think of it, like I said, as a foundational tool, as an enabler.
No, that's a great point. You know, whenever I have talked to the regulatory side of things, they always say, you know, you guys come in with 200 different assays and everyone does that measurements differently. It becomes slower from our point of view because we have to evaluate each of these methods on their own merit. Whereas if you all came together and standardized or consensus building that these are the certain tests that we all do and this is how we do it, then things will accelerate faster. As Amy was mentioning, you know, obviously that time for regulatory approval, you know, patients want that to be faster. And this is certainly one way to think about that. Maybe I can also ask you, you work for a government organization like this, Department of Commerce, and how do you think the role of government organizations in this public-private partnerships, not just, you know, academia and industry partnership or academia and patients partnership, but how does, especially in the recent years, in this space, does the different government organizations partnering with academia and industry to advance the field?
Right, and I think there's increased recognition of working together. So I think in recent years, there's been quite a few of these public-private partnerships that's been stood up precisely to accelerate, that's knowledge generation, accelerate technology development, accelerate manufacturing technologies and capabilities. So I personally very much value these partnerships. Another benefit that I think comes from CMAT, there's so much academia that's involved. That's the future, right? These are the workforce that's going to come to industry and government labs. These are the future innovators. And so I think, you know, CMAT serves that critical role in bridging, and to have government agencies along with industry and academia at the same, you know, in the same room really brings that perspective. And like we said earlier, get people planning early, think about problems more holistically.
I mean, thank you so much for bringing that up. You know, what we didn't get to cover today is this whole idea of workforce development and partnerships to develop the next generation of workforce. You know, as I mentioned before, CMAT has programs in rural high schools in Georgia to train them, to train the high school teachers so they can go back to their classrooms and introduce biotechnology there. We have programs in the two-year community and technical colleges and so on. And maybe in the, you know, the last few minutes we have left, I can ask Greg from an industry perspective to comment on the workforce issue. You know, how do you all see the importance of that next generation, highly trained workforce, given the context that this is such a complex manufacturing space?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different classes of workforce we need right now. Certainly, there's the high-tech area where we have the scientists that develop the processes and the methods to measure these cells. And to do the automation, et cetera. So I think we typically will look to the biomedical engineering programs, the biochemical engineering programs, the biological sciences for those. And then as we think about this very labor-intensive type of process right now, this autologous process, we have a lot of hands-on work that needs to be done. And you know, that may go away as we automate more and as we go to a universal donor type approach, but I still think there's going to be quite a bit of labor involved, especially when we think about the numbers of patients we want to serve. So again, there, I guess, less advanced degrees, but still in the biological sciences, biotechnology, we want people to understand a little bit, at least, about how the cells work fundamentally. Certainly when you're a manufacturing operator, a QC analyst, you're asked to follow the same procedure over and over. That doesn't mean you shouldn't think. You should understand what you're doing. So I think it really spans a pretty large gamut of types of students we're looking for, from the more advanced degrees to the bachelor's and even associate's degrees.
Excellent. And Aaron, you know, you head the workforce development group and in CMAT. From your perspective, and you have seen programs from high school all the way to graduate students, postdoctoral. Where do you think organizations like CMAT can make the greatest impact?
Well, there's a lot of different places where CMAT can impact, and I think this goes to Greg's point that there are workforce needs across the spectrum. My sense is there's a really big opportunity for CMAT to leverage some of our connections at the sort of entry levels and to draw students in. So building connections, building excitement around cell therapies and cell manufacturing, even just the awareness that there are careers in cell manufacturing is information that so many students at the high school or tech college or, you know, bachelor's level are not aware of, right? And there are good jobs coming from the tech colleges into these manufacturing positions, and there's some really strong jobs coming out of the 4-year out of a bachelor's level program where you're playing an important role in some really exciting science, right? And so I think the building connections really gives us this opportunity to be sort of I don't want to say marketer, but to raise a flag about the importance of this field, and particularly the growing importance of this field. And I think that can only help to draw students in and to help train that future workforce.
Excellent point. I think we are pretty much out of time today. I really want to thank each and every one of you. And I hope, you know, the audience really had a good flavor of, you know, how patient advocates, standards organization, industry, academia, government, policy, ethics, workforce development, all of these aspects can work together to advance a certain healthcare aspects. And I hope you will have the opportunity to look at what CMAT is doing. Again, the website is cellmanufacturingusa.org. And again, if you have any questions, please reach out to us. And thank you for listening today.